Thanks for that. It's great to see such a great turnout today. I'm going to talk about ADHD in children and adolescents, myths, truths and treatment. Bit of a mouthful for this hour of the evening, I must say. I've been working with young people with ADHD for over 10 years now, and I suppose I've heard a lot of myths kind of floating around about ADHD, so I'm going to discuss the facts. I'm going to discuss how ADHD, what it looks like in this age group, how we assess it, what treatments are available, and finish off then with some tips for parents and talk about some useful resources, books and websites. And as has been stated before, if you have any questions, you can pop them down on the page that was on your chair there, and we'll try and get to as many as possible at the very end of the evening after all three speakers. So this is one of the myths. Can you read that? I agree with the theory that there are no bad kids, just bad parents. Obviously, this is a myth and not true. Parents do not cause ADHD, but of course they are part of the solution because they're with their kids 24/7. And I suppose we all know parenting itself at the best of times isn't an easy job. Kids don't come with manuals. And if you have a child with ADHD, it can be challenging, particularly if you have a child who's a bundle of energy like the child here. And this adult is saying, how many kids do you actually have? And I suppose it's important to remember that kids with ADHD aren't deliberately being difficult. They just act before they think. So here are some more of the myths, that there isn't any such thing as ADHD. ADHD doesn't exist, it's not real, it's just poor parenting. The child is just bold, just lazy, or they're loaded up with sugar. And all those are obviously completely untrue. So we know that ADHD is real. Researchers using the latest in brain imaging technologies have shown differences in specific parts of the brain that control attention and impulse and organisation and planning. And we know that there's low levels of arousal in those parts of the brain, and also that there's chemical imbalances, so that there isn't enough of the two chemical messengers specifically called dopamine and noradrenaline. So we know it is a biological condition. We know that there is a physical basis for it. I suppose if you think of the brain as a kind of a complex machine, it's that there is a difficulty with the fine-tuning in specific areas. And it's these areas that normally would put the brakes on unwise behaviour, but with ADHD there is no brakes. And also ADHD symptoms are listed in both of the manuals that are used internationally to make various diagnosis. Confusingly, they are called something slightly different in both, but it is the same cluster of ADHD symptoms. I was Googling images for impulsivity and this popped up, and it might be the one example of a bad parent and a bold child, possibly. But what is ADHD? Well, there's three main symptoms: problems with attention, overactivity, and impulsivity. And some people would have all three, and some people would have mainly the attention problems. In particular, girls, we find that boys are referred an awful lot earlier because they tend to have these symptoms. And obviously, if you're dealing, with an overactive child at home that's into all kinds of dangerous stuff, you're going to go to the GP earlier and get a referral earlier. Whereas with girls, they're often really quiet. They're kind of daydreaming in class, looking out the window, but they're not actually causing any trouble. So very often we find they're not actually referred until the teenage years, when teachers notice that there's a mismatch between their level of ability and how they're doing an exam, that something just isn't adding up and that they should be getting better grades. So they refer in then for assessment. So looking at those attention problems then in a bit more detail, these would be things like poor concentration and focus, particularly in school. They get easily distracted. We'd often look at report cards and you'd see those kind of comments like poor concentration, needs to concentrate better, needs more focus, things like that. They can be quite forgetful. Often kids kind of rush through homework. There's lots of mistakes. They don't finish things. So when I started running ADHD clinics initially, when I started work, I foolishly put out about 30 boxes of toys and soon learnt that I would spend about an hour tidying them up at the end of the evening, because kids with ADHD start one thing, get a bit bored, move on to the next, get a bit bored before they finish with that toy, move on to the next. And also parents would often say to me as well that kids often don't follow through on after school activities. So they might say start swimming, do 2 classes, kind of lose interest, move on to something else, maybe do 3 classes, move on to something else until they get something that actually catches their interest. Often kids with ADHD seem not to listen. They seem as if they're not following instructions. So for example, mum might say, would you go up and tidy your room? It's an absolute tip. So the child toddles off, sees the kitchen, thinks, oh, I'm thirsty, I'll go and get myself a drink of milk. Then they see the TV is on, pop in there's something on TV, watch that for 10 minutes, look out the window, the pal is on a bike, out they go. So by the end of the evening, mom pops up to the room and the place is still an absolute pigsty. And organisational skills can be a real issue as well. And again, we would see a lot of kids really struggle when they move from primary school to secondary school, because in secondary school there's a huge amount of organisation. There's different classes, different books. So very often they arrive home and they can't do their homework because they've forgotten some of the books, they're still in the locker, or they arrive into school and they've left the homework at home. One mum just felt so sorry for her son, her teenage son, who had started first year and was just constantly getting into trouble, that she actually bought 2 sets of secondary school books, one for the school and one for home. And we all know how much secondary school books cost, but she felt that was one way of managing that, which she was really struggling with. These are the hyperactive impulsive symptoms then. So the active ones are fidgeting, difficulty sitting still in your seat, hopping up from your seat, being always on the go. Parents of young children would often say it's like having the Duracell buddy at home that never runs out of batteries. Often the kids are quite, they're chatterboxes, they talk a lot, they talk loudly, they kind of play quite loudly, they're there. They can be impulsive as well. Sometimes they'll act and they'll talk without thinking. So for example, one little 8-year-old came into me for assessment, looked at me and he said, what age are you? He said, you've lots of wrinkles, you look really old. And the mother was absolutely mortified. So I was hoping that it's just for an 8-year-old, anyone over the age of 20 looks ancient enough that I need to invest in a better moisturiser perhaps. These symptoms can cause a lot of problems in school. This is why these kids are referred in quite early on. So things like, leaving the seat in class, not lining up in the schoolyard. They have difficulty taking turns in class. So rather than put up the hand, they just literally blurt out the answer. And that can be very disruptive in a classroom setting, particularly in large Irish classrooms where you can have over 30 kids. They interrupt conversations. This can cause problems with their friends. They unthinkingly break rules, and that's a really important point, because with the behavioural problems it's different. There's a deliberate breaking of rules. This is unthinking. They don't think about the consequences. It's just very impulsive. They just do it. And also they can get involved in dangerous activities. So for example, parents would often tell us that, we're frequent flyers in A&E. They know us now because Johnny has fallen off the tree so many times that I see a lot of heads nodding there, that, there might be sprains or broken arms. One mum called her son when he was quite young. He was very active, and she actually called him Spider-Man. He managed to scale a 6-foot wall she put up in the back garden to try and keep him safe, because it backed onto quite a busy road. And on one occasion actually found him on the roof of the house. So really dangerous stuff. Now obviously all those symptoms, like problems with attention, we can all have that from time to time. Hopefully that's not something that you're suffering from at the minute, that you've lost interest in my talk and you've all gotten distracted and are drifting off. But for a diagnosis of ADHD, those symptoms must be severe. They must be excessive for the child's age. So for example, if you have a son, say, that's just after starting junior infants and isn't, standing quietly in line and is jumping out of the line, you mightn't be worried about that of every other boy as well, as, acting the same. Whereas if that child is jumping out of the line and the teacher's calling you when he's 9, that's a different kettle of fish altogether. IQ is important as well. Kids with low IQ can have attention difficulties, so it's only if it's excessive that we'd start wondering about ADHD. The symptoms must be there before the age of 7 and persist then over time. And for a diagnosis, they must be causing significant interference with home life, with school life, relationships with family members, with friends. Very often these symptoms are most obvious in a structured setting like school, because in school you are expected to sit still and pay attention and concentrate. So it'll be very obvious there if they are issues for you. and the symptoms must be present in 2 or more settings. So for example, if those symptoms are only present in school, we might wonder about something like a learning difficulty rather than ADHD. And the other thing to bear in mind is it mightn't actually be obvious in a new setting. So I've often carried out initial assessments. So I meet the family with the parents for the first time, and they're talking about Johnny swinging from the chandeliers at home. And Johnny is as quiet as a mouse in the corner. And parents will say, like, you must think I'm an awful liar. Like, he's not normally like this. So I always do ask that, is this typical behaviour? Because very often when they're coming into a new place, new toys, new people, it catches their attention, and it wouldn't be typical behaviour. But we do see it then as we get to know the child better. So based on all of that and you know how many of the symptoms you have, there are 3 main types of ADHD. So if you have the mainly hyperactive impulsive type, it's ADHD predominantly hyperactive impulsive. If you mainly have the attention problems, it's like Pooh Bear there, kind of the daydreamer, inattentive. Sometimes the Americans call that ADD, or attention deficit disorder. And then if you've all 3, you have the combined types. So you have all 3 of the problems with attention, impulsivity and hyperactivity. So this is often how kids with ADHD describe it, that literally they just have to get the words out, or they feel like they'll explode. So there's no filter. The words just literally come straight out. And parents often kind of talk about the Bermuda Triangle, that they say something, goes into the Bermuda Triangle, and the information never comes out again. This is a question I get asked an awful lot by parents. When we discuss ADHD, they say, well, you know, how can they have ADHD? They can sit down and play, you know, their computer game for 2 hours or 3 hours. Their attention is excellent when it comes to the computers. And that's because if something holds their attention will be really, really good. And that's why when they go on in later life to choose careers, if they pick a career that really interests and really grabs their attention, they can do really well. So how common is ADHD? Well, different studies will tell you different things, but we know it's present in about 2 to 5% of children. So that's about 1 child in a class of 20, and given that our classes aren't that small, that's probably 1 or 2 kids in each class, so that's quite frequent. CAMS are the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Services, and they've produced 5 reports every November for the last 5 years. And every single year, the most common condition that they see comes up as ADHD, about 1/3 of the kids that they see. And they have more males attending their clinics than females. It's 4 times more common in males. And again, as I explained earlier, that's because it's probably the hyperactive, impulsive boys that are getting referred in rather than the girls. They're probably getting missed for a few years. So in terms of assessment, I mean, the internet is a great tool for some things, but not for diagnosing ADHD. If you are worried, you do need to go to the GP and then get a referral for an assessment. And it's a little bit, I suppose, an assessment is a little bit like detective work. As I said, you know, ADHD is present in 2 or more settings, so you need to get information from parents about home life and information from school and teachers about school life. We use rating scales with parents, teachers and teenagers also. We observe the child in the clinic, and we make sure that, you know, something else isn't going on that might be explaining the attention problems, because attention problems themselves may not always be ADHD, might be anxiety and stress, and, you know, you're distracted by whatever is stressing you out, or it might be a learning difficulty, or it could be both. So it really is like detective work, and it's a bit like a jigsaw and trying to pull all the pieces together. And sometimes we might recommend other assessments. So if there are any worries about their hearing, we might ask the GP to arrange a hearing test. Or if we're worried about speech and language, we'll ask for an assessment. Or we might ask for an educational psychological assessment if we are worried about learning difficulties. And ADHD rarely occurs on its own. There's usually something else going along hand in hand with it. So examples would be behavioural problems, learning difficulties such as dyslexia, dyspraxia or developmental coordination disorder, speech and language difficulties. And parents are often a bit puzzled about this because they say, sure, he's really chatty and he's really loud. But a lot of these kids can have receptive language difficulties. That's the understanding of language. So if you have a child with attention problems and they have difficulties understanding language as well, school is going to be quite difficult, or just following instructions and understanding instructions is going to be difficult. So it's important to pick it up. Some kids with autism have ADHD as well. Some get a bit stressed or problems with mood. Teenagers with untreated ADHD might start dabbling in drugs to self-medicate. and some kids will also have tics. This shows the difficulty kids sometimes have in getting to sleep, that their mind is quite active, and you can see they're quite distracted, jumping from one topic to another, and that's quite a common co-occurring difficulty we see, as is low self-esteem. And I suppose this just highlights the importance of setting limits around technology, because if kids do have sleep difficulties, it's important that they're not taking their phones and computers and stuff to bed, because the light from those kind of electronics does interfere with melatonin production, which helps us fall asleep. So in terms of treatment then, if ADHD is present, what can we do? And there's lots of different treatment guidelines. And the good news is there's lots of different treatments, as you can see there, and that's probably not even a comprehensive overview. And I suppose the important thing to point out is that every child is different, so every child should have an individualised treatment package, and is discussed with parents, and what's best and what's right for their child is agreed with them. But one of the most important things is, to learn about ADHD and what it is, because to deal with ADHD, it's very hard to deal with something if you don't know what you're dealing with. So getting verbal and written information about ADHD, knowing what, good websites are out there is really important. Having information about support groups like HAD, that can be very helpful for parents. Behavioural interventions like parent training. We said earlier on, parents aren't the problem, but they are part of the solution. So sometimes there are general parenting programmes, such as The Incredible Years or Parents Plus in the community, or in some of the CAMS clinics I've worked in, they run very specific programmes for parents on parenting a child with ADHD, because there are very specific challenges. Some children do need extra support in school, so if you think your child needs extra support, it's important to talk to the school about an IEP or an individual education plan, or they may be able to access NEPS, the Educational Psychological Service nationally, and they can decide whether an SNA or additional resource hours are needed in school. Medication I'm going to cover in the next 2 slides. Sometimes we work individually with the child, sometimes with the family, or sometimes offer group therapies to the child. So that might be social skills group or the alert group. That's a group that was developed for, or a programme that was developed for young children with attention problems. It looks at how their engine runs, whether it's just right or too high and too low, and if it is too high or too low, what they can do about it. They might benefit from psychological therapies if self-esteem is an issue or problem solving is an issue. If there are co-occurring conditions, it's important that they're identified and treated and managed. And obviously a good balanced diet and regular exercise is important as well. So in terms of medication, medication does work well with ADHD, because, as we said earlier, there is a chemical imbalance, and that's what the medication addresses. And there's 2 groups really, the stimulants and the non-stimulants. The stimulants would include methylphenidate or Ritalin. That's the one a lot of people kind of have heard about. And I suppose just to say, the internet can be very helpful, but particularly in relation to Ritalin, just be very careful when you are accessing information on the internet that it is coming from a reliable site. And there's short and long acting versions. So the short acting version would last for about 3 to 4 hours. So you take it 2 or 3 times a day. And there's long acting versions as well. And Ritalin has been around for over half a century now. Dexamphetamine has been around for quite a while also, and lisdexamphetamine or Tyvence is a relatively new medication. Then the non-stimulants, atomoxetine or Strattera, is a non-stimulant, and that's very different to the stimulants. It takes a couple of weeks, at least 4 to 6 weeks, before you know whether it's going to work or not, and you must take it every day, unlike the stimulants where you can chop and change if you want, but atomoxetine then will give you 24-hour coverage. And medication is meant to reduce the 3 main symptoms. So it will improve attention, it will reduce hyperactivity and overactivity, and reduce impulsivity as well. And obviously with all medication, all medications have risks of side effects, so it's important that your child is reviewed regularly and screened for those. So examples would be, pains in the tummy or headaches are quite common on starting medication. It can affect their appetite, reduce their appetite, interfere with their sleep, things like that. And while there are risks of medication, it's important to remember there are risks of untreated ADHD, particularly if it's severe ADHD as well. So it's balancing up those risks and deciding what's right for your child. We talk about drug holidays sometimes as well. That's when you take a break from the medication, and that would be really for two main reasons. The first would be if we were worried, about we do monitor their weight and their height. If we're worried about their growth or their weight, we might take them off medication for a little bit just to allow catch-up growth. But it is often recommended to take a drug holiday once a year just to see how are they managing off medication. Do they still need it? And that should obviously be done at a time that's relatively settled. Like bang in the middle of the leaving cert wouldn't be a great time to be trying a drug holiday if a child is quite stable on medication. And a lot of people say, look, I'm very reluctant to have my child on medication, but they really do need it at school, and they choose to have their child on medication just on school days, and then they don't take it on holidays, they don't take it on weekends, and that's absolutely fine with the stimulants. But then one parent saw the benefit, medication was having at school. So she said, I'm just going to try it at the weekend, because her child was having a lot of trouble on the football pitch, and he was really been isolated by the team because he was very, very distracted and quite impulsive. So he wasn't performing very well, and she knew that he was really a very good football player. So she gave him medication one Saturday morning just to see how he would respond, and he performed really, really well. The team were delighted, so she decided then she would use it just on school days and when he had matches or training as well. So in terms of then kind of tips for parents, it's really important to catch your child being good, because very often at school and at home they hear don't do this, stop doing that, because they are very impulsive, they're doing stuff they shouldn't be doing. So it's really important to build their self-esteem, catch them being good. And to build on your child's strengths. So if they're good at things, to get them involved in clubs or activities or whatever, and again, it's to boost their self-esteem. ADHD isn't a license for, misbehaviour, so all kids benefit from having very clear routines and rules at home. To catch their attention, if you're going to ask them to do something, it can be really helpful just to make eye contact with them, use very short, clear sentences, and give them one instruction at a time. If you tell them to do 4 or 5 different things, they're probably lost after the first thing, so just one instruction at a time. Involve them in after-school activities that can burn off a lot of energy, can help with sleep as well. Kids with ADHD are often very good visually, and they're usually living on their phones. So, to tap into that and, maybe to use to-do lists on phones, or very often homework is a problem and kind of finishing the homework. So very often you can get countdown timers and you set it for whatever it is, 10 minutes, or say they have to get something done in 15 minutes, and actually set it so the child can actually see and visually track how much time they've left. Know their friends. That's really important, particularly in the teenage years where, teenagers are probably the biggest source of influence they have, and what are their friends into and what are they dabbling in or what are they trying out. So get to know who they are. And consider the siblings as well. Very often there's so much attention on parenting the child with ADHD, because it does take a lot more effort. It's just important to bear in mind that the siblings might be finding it difficult. Johnny might be going in and trashing the room or whatever. So maybe to have a few rules around that. So maybe that the siblings' room is off bounds and there's an absolute veto on interfering with homework. And maybe having some one-to-one time with the brother or sister at the weekend, yourself as well. And choose your battles. You can't be fighting with them every step of the way. So see what are the little things that you can let go, and then what are the behaviours that you really do need to tackle. To be kind of positive in how you correct them. So say, for example, they shovel down food at the dinner table and they take off, rather than saying, oh, that's awful, that's awful the way you leave the dinner table. Maybe, to say something like, it'd be lovely if you could sit down, and sit with us until we're all finished our meals. Give lots of attention for good behaviour. You obviously want more of the good behaviour. To be on the same page as parents. Kids will try and play one parent off the other. So if they go to mum and she says no, they'll go to dad and see will he say yes. So it's important that you're both saying the same thing. And this is so important, to look after yourself. It's very hard, it's a hard job being a parent. It is hard parenting a child with ADHD, so make sure you take time out for yourself, even if it's something like a cup of coffee by yourself at the end of the day, or read the paper for 20 minutes, meeting your friends for coffee at the weekend, whatever, but making sure you do mind yourself, because you need to look after yourself to look after them. And I suppose ADHD is classified as a disorder. I suppose I like to think of it as a difference, and difference is good. If we were all the same, the world would be a very boring place. And a lot of the kids I've worked with ADHD have been the most energetic, fun-loving and creative kids. So there are lots of positives as well. It's important to focus on that. In terms of resources then, HAD have a very good website, and they do have lists of books and websites as well. And there's loads and loads of books out there on ADHD, and this one is quite old, Christopher Green's Understanding ADHD, but I still have to say I probably find it the easiest to read for parents, and it has chapters on practically every question I ever get from parents, so it's quite comprehensive, and I just got it in my local bookstore, so I find that quite good. Sometimes then parents ask me, what can I give to my child or my teenager, and this one here that I've listed, that's for 6 to 12-year-olds, and it's just written in a very kind of child-friendly way, and tips, to help themselves. And then this one, ADHD at your fingertips for teenagers, that obviously tackles other issues more relevant to teenagers, such as managing anger, alcohol, drugs, driving, things like that. And then in terms of resources for the school, there is a very good book that's downloadable on the HAD website. You can just click in and download it. Or that website as well has quite a comprehensive guide for schools. So if you have any questions about ADHD in children or teenagers, you can write them down, and we will try and get to as many as we can at the end of the evening. And in the meantime, keep calm and parent on.